So most of the folks in the audience are CEOs.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, with hypergrowth startups, we have to hire a lot of developers. Also, hiring can be really challenging.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on how should an entrepreneur start to build a developer community? When does it make sense to start engaging with that community? Like, what are some best practices that you have?
Yeah, so in terms of developing a community, I think it's important to sort of pay attention to, the long-term fundamentals of really sort of marketing yourself on the internet, like finding your voice, developing a brand that people can relate to and understand. That's maybe different from some of your other customers, depending on, you probably have different constituents. If you sell directly to developers, you're probably going to have a different brand than if you need to hire developers but also sell to someone else. And then I think it's a lot about paying attention to your wins and running with it, but then also just doing a lot of listening. So the question is, I think, a little different if you're looking to hire and if you're looking to sort of develop a community. But one of the fundamentals of any of these things is to throw away some of your preconceptions about where the best developers are. Be pretty flexible about the interests and needs of developers, because if you have some flexibility, you're going to find some really great talent. And then ultimately be the kind of company that developers want to work for, and they're going to tell their friends.
Yeah, it's awesome. What's interesting, so we've talked about this, or you've said it as well, where oftentimes the projects and the things that get developers excited is sometimes very different from the things that maybe more CEOs or more like revenue-minded founders get excited about. Yeah. Can you kind of talk about like what are some things that get developers excited, and how is that potentially different from that of a startup's business agenda?
Yeah, so I think developers are often excited by some things that seem less exciting. I sometimes, if an interesting test automation tool hits the scene, developers get very excited, and that's a very boring thing, test automation. Like just like automating your code before it goes up, so you have better visibility into whether it's going to break. Because developers, the more experience they have, the more pain they've lived through. And the pain in software development is sort of the most memorable part. People, I don't think, act always on their favorite memories. They sort of want to lessen the pain. So vitamins don't always work for software developers. Medicine and painkillers, are very appealing. And so software developers, in some ways, they're really excited about AI, ML, a lot of like the trendiest sort of cutting edge stuff. Everyone's like a little excited about that on some scale. Some are really excited, but everyone's pretty excited when a really polished tool hits the market that they feel actually fits their existing workflow. They can see how they can kind of incorporate it without sort of changing everything else, without suffering a lot of pain through the process. So, when GitHub launched Actions, it really got people really excited, even though it didn't even hit the market yet at first. It was, part of people's kind of flow. It really like helped their process. So even stuff like linting is the process in software development of just sort of tabs and spaces. And linting tools, get people excited. It's funny, like, it's less different year to year than I think sometimes people realize in the startup community. Realizing that like the most exciting things in the startup community are not necessarily the things that get developers as excited, and developers can get excited by some very boring things for other kind of people in tech.
So let's say there are some developer tools in the audience. So let's say that someone has built one of these painkillers for developers. Yep. How would you go about getting this, like taking this product to market? How do you actually build something and actually get it in front of the right developers?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely one of those areas where things that don't scale can really help. Getting a few fans, users really on board, really helps these things spread. People love to give talks about things that that's scored them some wins in their process. So you reach a few people who really love the tool and can possibly give back to the tool in some way. Leveraging open source in that way is always helpful. You score some wins with some of the right people, and they're going to tell their friends. People are going to write about it. It's going to spread pretty naturally. Trying to invest too much in like paid acquisition, just like a lot of other startup ideas, the developer ecosystem can be chaotic and can be hard to kind of become sticky. And I think you do that by reaching a dedicated fan base at first and hoping they tell their friends, and they will if it's solving a real problem.
Controversial question, but have you ever seen this go wrong? So like you're talking about building a community and doing things that don't scale, which feels like a very organic way of growing and kind of like moving into more of a dev-friendly company.
Yep.
Have you ever seen examples, or have there been some lessons learned where, either entrepreneurs or someone has tried to like push into the developer community and it hasn't turned out well? Like I'm trying to understand what is like authentic versus inauthentic, and how do we balance both, like move fast but still maintain authenticity?
Yeah, authenticity is definitely one of the most important terms here. Developers can smell bullshit, like incredibly sensitive nose for that sort of thing. And sometimes oversensitive, like developers can become sort of jaded and cynical, and you try to reach them with the wrong messaging. It's going to injure your brand. You're not going to, you're going to sort of live through some pain. Actually, I think as much as MongoDB has, truly become a total success, and like they're a public company, and they're skyrocketing like in the public markets, and like they're incredibly successful. I think they suffered through some pain of being like a database company that occasionally lost the trust of the community, because data and trust go hand in hand, and they worked through it. They had great relations. They stuck to the fundamentals. They became the winner in a space that seemed like it was going to have be the next big thing, and it turned out it was just Mongo plus each of the major cloud providers has a solution as well, but in the NoSQL community. But there's been some other attempts which have sort of failed by failing to kind of work through the actual pain developers were having and bring the product people cared about, even if it was useful. So as in contrast to Mongo, RethinkDB, another database, very similar model. It is an open source database. It lives on as a project, not with some popularity, but still a lot of pain. But the company folded. They got acqui-hired by Stripe. They just didn't really solidify the trust. Didn't get the messaging about why this was a really differentiated product. I had some experience working with it. I think I remember it being a little more painful than it needed to be, and they just didn't get it right. Even though the technology was, they didn't fail. Mongo failed in a lot of the same ways early on, and I think they did a good job of maintaining trust in their brand and understanding the more boring value propositions that sometimes people cared about.
That makes sense. Do you feel like with Mongo, with GitHub, with Twilio, with some of the more mature companies, do you notice a different type of developer that wants to join and work at these companies? Like, do you see different waves of some developers are more early stage startup individuals, others want to join because there's different problems to solve once the company starts to mature? How do you think about the various different types of developers?
Yeah, that's definitely a spectrum that exists. So I think folks in the Silicon Valley area also tend to over-index on the people that are sort of in their physical universe, which represent a pretty small percentage of overall developers. So yeah, I think Twilio really, they're gaining a lot. They've always, had success because they solve a lot of really fundamental problems. But I think for a while they had a harder time reaching the more excited developer community in some way, especially after I think SMS became a little less exciting for people. So like at the height of maybe the chatbot excitement, maybe Twilio had a certain bit of momentum, which faded a bit, and then but they stayed strong because they have good fundamentals. And then they, I think, became a more appealing option for the, more like people who cared more about the fundamentals of communication. And so they've got sort of different markets, but it is like the people who care about the most like interesting, innovative things that a company like that will do are definitely a different crowd than the people who think that like the communication pipes of the software industry are the most exciting part. And very different people. You don't necessarily have to try too hard to like overemphasize either one, because if you're clear about your value proposition and you have a good-looking brand, people are going to sort of understand. So I don't know if you want to over-communicate where you stand on that spectrum, because you probably need to hire people on either one, but you should have an idea of what value you bring to each kind of person.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think that it's interesting to see. I think you do a really great job with DevDot too, as far as having a space for developers to also communicate the things that they want to work on, or it's sort of like the things that you're currently thinking about versus maybe the things that are currently on your resume. Can you kind of talk through, like, are you noticing any trends where people, as we're transitioning to more of a world of active learning, or we're seeing more specifically with decentralized companies where like the need for community is sort of increasing over time and the need for developers to connect with other developers is changing over time?
Yeah, so it's interesting that this is really, the decentralized nature of software development and the idea of asynchronous communication as being so important has been sort of with us forever. Like the start of the World Wide Web had all these fascinating asynchronous conversations between like Mark Andreessen and Tim Berners-Lee, who represent two incredibly different ends of the spectrum in terms of software development personalities, but two like super brilliant people who understood the power of the web early on, and that same sort of fundamentals of communication and how community happens hasn't ever gone away, and is probably having a resurgence because of remote work, which it's possible is just the default in our industry going forward. I would say if I were to guess that I think that would be the case, and I think there's going to be some purpose for campuses as part of a strategy, but distributed work and more fundamentally like asynchronous communication as the thing that like enables it is critical. And you see a lot of companies building really good tools that help with this. So Slack is useful for both synchronous and asynchronous. There's a paper trail. Notion is a really great product that I think solves a lot of problems. And then GitHub for asynchronous communication was really the big one for software developers. The part where you use Git and merge the code and stuff is what GitHub's built on, but that didn't really mean GitHub was going to be successful, but they really understood communication and continue to kind of innovate and build on that.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's really interesting. I think specifically with some of the earlier stage companies that I know or hear, oftentimes you'll have maybe a few core team members or like early founders are based in Silicon Valley, but behind the scenes you have an army of developers either in your home country if you grew up overseas, or you start to build more remote edge offices sooner rather than later just due to costs in the Bay Area. What are your thoughts on like some ways to not only like find the right devs, but also some ways to think about employee retention and what sort of motivates them over time.
Yeah, in terms of especially on distributed teams and stuff, retention and motivation is probably the hardest thing. Communication is not a real problem if you know what you're doing. But it's really hard to tell if someone really hates their job, like when you don't see them. We have a portion of our team remote, a portion of our team. I mean, nobody's like fully. We don't have we have an office in Brooklyn. I don't even go in most days. It's like just kind of early on we did more in person because we just had to kind of work through like less organized stuff. But eventually, saving the time on commute became so much better. But we have one person who works for us full time as a contractor now in Russia, and I communicated with her when we were hiring her. One of my co-founders, I think, talked to her via video call, but I don't even know what she looks like. But we have tremendous communication. We have great vibes, and then we've also had some issues with just like we had a hard time as the home base kind of communicating with folks, and I've seen it really go horribly wrong in some cases where like you just have no idea what's going on over there. Like you're just praying that this distributed team is doing the things you want them to be doing, and you go downhill and you fail. So you need to be sort of agile. You need to kind of develop an understanding of what's going on and really over-communicate everything.
Got it. So process, communication. You mentioned Slack is great for that. Notion can be another as well. What about in terms of like career development and mentorship? Because I've seen a couple of platforms, like Plato is one where you're able to get mentored by more senior managers at other companies. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like there's a need for ongoing education, or how do you think about retention when it comes to like not only hiring, but then training and continuous education with developers?
Yeah, I think with continuous education, there's a sense that I would think that the hardest part is that there's probably not going to be like any singular tools which are overly effective because of the hyper-specific nature of a lot of software development problems. So you need to sort of learn by like immersion, and that's what's great about when you're hired into a company with an office. You can kind of be a fly on the wall in certain discussions and stuff, and that's definitely not the case as much in distributed environments. And I think the most important thing for the individual developer and for a team looking to be successful when you're looking to have your distributed team like learn and get better, I think is to look for self-starters and for developers to become self-starters, because there is a huge amount of resources out there, and there's a huge amount of helpfulness from the senior developer community. And they're always being proactive, and the good ones are really getting ahead of things, but people get lost when they're waiting around for someone to kind of solve their problem. Because me at my home, like me working at our HQ or in my home, I have a hard time. Like I won't know if you're just struggling through one little thing, and I could just quickly help you out. Like. You need to be able to communicate back up like what's going on with your day. We don't want to know like every detail you go through. Like we want you to be able to kind of take a walk with your dog, and we don't like come back to your computer. We don't like want to know where you are, but we really need to know what you're going through. So it's those little moments that sort of push you in the right direction, and you need to kind of communicate that back up. And as the founders, as the people vested in the success of our hires and our contractors, we need to make it easy for them to do that. So that's kind of the dynamic, because then the education happens on its own, like throughout the community. Like so much of what we do is education. There's education everywhere. GitHub, Stack Overflow, organizations that specialize in the education process explicitly, and it happens very organically as long as there's communication. Good, solid two-way communication and ground-up communication from the newer developers and stuff.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's interesting too because I've seen this in companies that have a culture centered or focused on transparency. I think if you have a very open culture where it feels like no ask is too small, and you can kind of create these systems where it's easy to communicate, it's easy to ask for help without feeling like embarrassed or like you're failing. So it's great to hear. I think that you guys have done that really well. I think another thing that Dev has done really well is I think that by building a community, you have been able to partner with other great tech companies. Can you talk about, like, I know you've done some work with Netlify or with Replit. Like, how do you view your job as a founder in terms of like helping other companies or in terms of building long-term relationships? Because I think for this audience, what's interesting is we're all around the same size and same stage, and I think there's an opportunity to either do things as tactical as like coming together for a hackathon or just like really starting to build the community from day one. Do you have any thoughts on like how you started that from the beginning?
Yeah, in terms of successes and failures in partnerships and getting along with organizations, I think consistent learnings for us have been to walk away from discussions with some like next steps, even if they're like the simplest thing, and even if it's like be good at having the right ask. Like, you'll leave a conversation with someone and you'll be like, cool, like, you should, start using our platform like creatively. It's like kind of like hard to like stoke creativity in people. Like, you should like, if you're creative with our partnership, it'll go great because you have all these tools we have for you. But that sometimes doesn't go far enough because people get busy with other things. Things come up. So some very simple takeaways to kind of get the ball rolling, really, help momentum happen and stuff like that. So, like I was just talking with sort of an important contact this morning at a big tech company who would love to be kind of using our platform to help communicate with their developers and things like that. So, and at the end of the conversation, he said, like, how can I kind of help you today as much as possible? And that's kind of been a hard question for us to answer. Like, just like, I don't know, like, just like be awesome, like be a good community member and stuff. So but like knowing that like the vaguer it is, the less likely anything will happen, I gave some like really boring things they could do like this afternoon that would just be helpful for us no matter what happens with our relationship. And one of those things was I asked them to put the dev logo on their personal homepage just like alongside Twitter, just as like a totally arbitrary specific ask. But it sort of cemented like, let's do one thing together and then the next step and the next step, and and that's kind of, even though you could go in any number of directions, having like a simple step zero with any relationship is incredibly important. And it's similar to kind of onboarding a new user. They're not going to start like becoming a power user on day one, but you want to give them a few simple steps to get started with your project, and then ultimately things happen through various aha moments along the way. Like relationships build, people kind of learn the tools and understand the nuances, and that's never going to happen if you're just constantly expecting them to figure it out on their own, or like leaving things vague, because then you're just like going to kind of forget about it and go home.
I think that's a really interesting point. I feel like with a lot of startups, we typically wait for a while before we start to approach the big tech companies or start to think about partnerships or working directly with them. I think oftentimes it's like prioritization, like how important is it to start building those relationships, and also how actionable is it going to be? Because I think a lot of times, like when talking to some of the large tech companies, you can kind of you kind of go down the rabbit hole of meeting after meeting after meeting. What have been some ways, like when would you recommend starting to build these relationships, and what have been some ways where you were able to kind of solicit those next steps and make sure that there was follow-up?
Okay, I think I have some really good, this like sparks some good thoughts about our like absolute origin stories, when it was just me, like not even our, just like me sitting around. But you're always going through different origin stories, so I think things like this kind of help at every kind of new beginning. But when I had the Twitter account, I had a bit of a following, I had this new kind of blog I was writing on and stuff, and I had the idea that if I interviewed some bigger names, that they would share the interview after that, and that would be a great way to kind of build things. And you know, interviewing someone via blog was good, and I like understand the issues. I'm a good communicator. I felt like if I have some good questions, it would be good content. So I just emailed some huge names, and they responded. I got like I literally at that point I got 100% yeses. I emailed the right people. I didn't even propose an interview. I just proposed me sending them a couple questions via email for them to answer, and then like just, you know, let's kind of treat this as if it were an interview, but I'm going to make it as simple as humanly possible for you, and just make the yes as easy as possible. And so like before there was any traction, you know, I got David Heinemeier Hansson, the founder of Basecamp and the creator of Rails, to do an interview, and he was excited because they were about to launch Rails 5, and he wanted to like get some of his thoughts out, and that was like an easy yes. And I'm like shy, introverted, you know, like I have to kind of work up the courage to do stuff like that. But it works if you understand that the person on the other end is going to say yes, and you sort of like a little self-reflection in that way really goes a long way. Like when you get an email and it's actionable, like the ask is easy for you to do, like with your own knowledge. Like software developers I know just like love blabbing about their things, like what we're doing right now, and making the ask easy and simple and within the person's wheelhouse is great. And I'm actually also kind of in a conversation with someone who proposed a fun little collaboration, and I'm actually personally struggling through it because I want to do it, but it's requiring us both to be creative and figure things out. And I would have kind of preferred if there was like a very specific ask, and if I disagreed, I could like tell them what I disagree with, and then we go from there. Versus like, okay, it's going to be something like this. Like, what do you think? Like, what do we think? Like, if you can lay out what your position is, let them know, you know, I have flexibility. I'm not demanding anything of you. I just like, this is a path. Let me know.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When you started telling the story, I think with developers, oftentimes I find that there's like the personal side of there's like the person, and then there's also the job. And what I think is really interesting about developers is I think some of the best examples that I've seen are more like thought leadership and content pieces and ways to work together, which I almost view that leaning into like the personal self of like, I'd like to work with you on a piece of content, or like, you know, this person as a developer would like to be known for a certain topic. Do you kind of lean into like the personal plus professional, where you're building relationships with the individual who may or may not stay at that current company, they may go to a different company? Like, how do you sort of view relationship building when it comes to the personal and the professional side of things?
Yeah, I definitely think that's pretty key to everything. Like, I have a friend at Microsoft at Azure, and when I met her, she was at Google. Like, she's now working with the total competitor, like in that specific space. Like, and that was like cool. And like we kind of have to, you know, understand there's a lot of fluidity there. Most business relationships are more personal than professional, really. Like honestly, people want to do business with people they can be friends with and stuff. I think it's important to understand appropriate boundaries for even just any personal relationship. Like, so you're not like, you have a relationship that's different from being best friends because I think I don't think it's necessarily healthy if people just do work with their friends, but like seek out the personal relationships with a variety of people that they can have in their lives, and ask personal questions, get coffee, and don't talk only about the work or the opportunity, and that's led to a lot of our success, my success. Just like being friendly, like offering to help on things that don't have an obvious like payoff.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that speaks a lot to also like the format of this event and why we're hosting it at GitHub. So GitHub, like that's part of their core ethos, and like they still deliver on that to date, where I think, like you said before, like when you invest in non-scalable things and when you proactively bring people together, like there's always a nice support group and people who are willing to be helpful. Like we're super grateful to have this space and love the work that GitHub is doing to actually just like facilitate these conversations and bring people together. So that's great. Ben, thank you. I'm going to open it up to Q&A if anyone has any questions.